Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Gilda Evans, bringing you the Autism Resource Podcast. This podcast and the ARP website are your one-stop knowledge and resource base for autism and much more. I'm honored to have Judy Mark join me as my guest today. Judy is president of Disability Voices United, an organization directed by and for people with disabilities and their families. DVU advocates for choice and control over our lives, meaningful outcomes that matter, and systems that are equitable and accountable. Judy has led efforts in California to enact several disability rights laws, spoken widely before diverse audiences, and appeared extensively in the media about disability issues, including on NBC News, the LA Times, and NPR. Judy also identifies as a person with a disability. Welcome, Judy, and thank you so much for taking the time to join me today and discuss the work you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
So today we're going to focus on emergency planning in light of the recent fires that have occurred in Los Angeles, as well as other disasters, natural and otherwise, that have happened countrywide recently. To begin with, please tell me, what are some of the biggest challenges that people with disabilities and their families face during emergencies, and what steps can they take to be better prepared?
That's such a critically important question, because people with disabilities are often left out of the planning processes when it comes to government agencies and first responders thinking about what to do in advance of an emergency, whether it's fires, earthquakes, floods, or even smaller emergencies like something happening at a very small level in somebody's house or on a block, is that because the systems are not planning for us, we need to plan for ourselves. There was a fire back in 2018 called the Woolsey Fire in Los Angeles County, where there was a post-mortem done. What could have been done better? How could the emergency services have responded better? And one of the major recommendations that came out of that was that there needs to be better processes to evacuate people with disabilities and people who are aging. And these recommendations were very clear, very detailed, and yet nothing was ever done. So then we faced in 2025 much more devastating fires in two different areas that were not close together in Los Angeles County that burned down significantly more structures, as well as burned down facilities where congregate housing was for people with disabilities and aging people. So like nursing homes or group homes. And so what ended up happening is that people with disabilities had a much higher chance of dying during these fires because they didn't have clear ways to evacuate. And even for those who were able to evacuate, the process was incredibly chaotic for them, which could also lead to poor health outcomes because of that. So what the biggest advice I have for anybody during a crisis, whether it's this kind of more natural or Mother Nature type crisis, or whether it could be a mental health crisis or a behavioral health crisis, the one thing I tell everybody is that you need to be prepared in advance. You need to know exactly the steps you're going to take before the crisis happens. And so that can be very detailed. It can be knowing who your circle of support is that you're going to call as the crisis occurs or as the emergency occurs. So when you say, who's that circle? So it might be, okay, if we know that a fire is happening, first of all, get out before anybody tells you to get out. If there is an evacuation warning that is not even mandatory, that is a few blocks from your home, you get out before it reaches your area, because that gives you so much more time to get out. But then you have to figure out who's going to get you out, particularly for people who use wheelchairs, who must be in a bed, who rely on, let's say, oxygen or other kinds of equipment, or even somebody who has a wheelchair that is electric, that requires a larger vehicle to get out. you need to know exactly who you're going to call and then have a backup, a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D. Because maybe your plan A is out of town. Maybe your plan A is also evacuating and cannot help you. There's a really horrible story in the Eaton fire in the Altadena area of a man who was an amputee and was not able to drive himself, who had a son with cerebral palsy, who was non-ambulatory and was unable to leave their home on their own. And instead of calling family to get them out, they dialed 911. And so what we know is dialing 911 is not going to work in an emergency because they are dealing with other issues. And the two of them perished in the fire. And it was an absolute tragic situation that could have been avoided by creating these plans in advance, because we really cannot count on our government services to be there for us.
Okay, so you've been talking about primarily what to do in the case of a fire. What I'd like to do is go into a little more detail with you now in terms of other big gaps in emergency preparedness that are there for people with disabilities, and how these shortcomings put lives at risk, and identifying exactly what they are so that they can do something about them. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. I was saying how we cannot count on the government or emergency first responders to be there for us. And so we have to create our own plans, but that doesn't let them off the hook. Like, we need to not wait for a couple of years for a postmortem of these fires. We need to make demands now that the first responders, emergency services have systems in place so that they know where facilities are, they know where nursing homes are, they know where individuals live who need and require extra assistance to evacuate. So what does that mean? It means that we as a disability community, both people with autism and people without autism, need to be putting pressure on our government to do better. And sometimes that's hard because we're not always an organized community to get this done. But we need to tell our stories now so that as recovery moves to thinking back, that we are putting in place systems so that we can make sure that these kinds of tragedies don't happen again. So what might that look like? I think that there's a lot of different ways you could advocate. One system is that you have an online system with the fire department, if you're talking about fires, but certainly it could be with other systems, that you register with the fire department to say, if there is an emergency, I need extra assistance to get out. And that means that there are ambulances that immediately go to these. There also could be systems in place because, at least in Los Angeles, there are a lot of private ambulance companies. There's not just your public paid county, your taxpayer paid for, or city paid for ambulance service, but there are private ambulance services. And there should be a contingency contract with these private ambulance services to go out and pick up people and evacuate them. But that's not all. And this is where I want to drill down on about people with autism versus people with other disabilities. If you have an elderly person or you have a person with cerebral palsy who uses a wheelchair, they require a certain type of evacuation, right? They may need to have a bed loaded into an ambulance. They may need to have a van that takes an electric wheelchair. There's a lot of things that you can figure that out. Autism is a very special thing because there are people with autism who become absolutely frozen during a time of crisis, or they start to have a meltdown if there's an external crisis. There is a tragic story in Northern California of a family whose house caught on fire. It was just one fire. It wasn't a big, giant fire like we've just had in Los Angeles County. It was their home caught on fire. And there were a number of people living in the home, and everyone ran out of the home and was completely safe. But there was a teenage boy living with autism in the home who was terrified seeing the flames and refused to leave. And he was a very big guy, and the mom could not get him out of the house and begged and tried to pull him out. And the two of them perished in the fire in their home. And so that is why, and that's not something that they had advance notice of, obviously, right? Because the fires here, we knew was going to be a wind event. We knew that there was a chance of fires. We saw the fires starting in the mountains and heading towards homes. You had some sort of warning. This is a case where there was no warning. Even in an individual circumstance, you have to work with people with autism to understand what it means to follow directions in an emergency. That here in California, we are expected to have a very large earthquake at some point in the future. I am a parent of a 28-year-old with autism, and I plead guilty to not having prepared him enough for it. What do you do if there is an earthquake? You go underneath a table, you run out into certain areas. There's certain emergency procedures, and we should have high expectations of people in our families who have autism or our friends who have autism, that they are going to understand what it means by practicing to prepare for an earthquake. So I think autism is a very different circumstance than it is for people with other disabilities. There's a friend of mine who has a brother with autism who lives in San Diego in a very fire-prone area. Usually every year something happens where they have to evacuate. He has a home that is completely built for him that he lives in. He can have property destruction at times if he's very dysregulated. And so they have windows that are non-breakable. They don't have anything breakable in the kitchen. They have prepared a home for him. The problem is when they have to evacuate, they have no place to go with him. They cannot go to a typical hotel room because they are afraid he will hurt himself, he will hurt others, he will hurt property. So he has no place to go. And his sister has been advocating for government agencies and government-funded nonprofits like regional centers to build sort of evacuation units that are arranged so that people with autism can use them and safely. That has not been done. She has now done it on her own, which is what those of us in the autism community usually have to do, and has purchased a trailer that you could live in with a bed and a bathroom that is completely built for him. And that trailer sits in their house. And if they have to evacuate, they take him in the trailer and they go park at a safe spot. Sometimes we have to take it on ourselves, but at the same time, we have to demand the government create these kind of safe spaces for people with autism in an emergency.
So speaking of demanding that the government do it, can you be a little bit more specific on the type of systemic changes at the state and federal level you feel could and should be implemented to ensure emergency plans truly include people with disabilities?
Like I say, when systems need to change, is that people with disabilities need to be not only sitting at the table, but at the head of the table when the decisions are being made. And that family members are sitting right next to them. And that just doesn't happen. So as people think back about the fires in Los Angeles County and they're looking at how could we have done better, they need to make sure that people with disabilities are right there saying, this is what works for me and this doesn't. Don't use guesswork. We know what's best for ourselves. Don't try to think, oh, maybe this might work. Ask us, use us. We have our own ideas of what you could do. You can talk about whether it's feasible or not, but we have our own ideas. And so the critical thing, whenever decisions are made about us, they should include us. It's the entire concept of nothing about us without us, of course. And this is a really prime example where decisions are made about emergency services 100% of the time without us sitting at the table. So I would start with systems knowing that we should be there and to listen to us. Secondarily, I think it's going to need a financial investment, which is not something most governments want to do anymore. I don't think it's going to be a massive investment, honestly. I think there are much larger investments that governments make, but it's going to be a small investment to ensure, for example, that you have a contract with private ambulances to evacuate people. And that contract only gets kicked in case of an emergency, in case of a fire emergency or earthquake emergency. I think that there are huge systems changes that can be made. You can also have people's phone numbers sitting on a list and that there are operators ready to go in an emergency. And believe me, we have lots of staff who can be doing this. We have an emergency line, not just dialing 911. We have something called 211 in Los Angeles County. Other places around the world have these kinds of systems where it's a non-emergency number. And there are hundreds of operators that work in these systems, and they could be getting the list of people with disabilities in a defined area to call them and say, have you evacuated? Are you okay? Or to call, if it's not the person with the disability, it's their closest family member. And so, that's going to be an investment, but that investment is well worth it, because right now we've had billions and billions of dollars of damage, but it's property damage that you can rebuild. Even though it's unbelievably tragic, you can rebuild a house. You cannot if a person loses their life, they're not coming back. So I think that there's a lot of systemic changes that need to be made, but they need to be talking to us first.
I couldn't agree with you more about that. And of course, here in LA, we're talking about fires and earthquakes, but in other parts of the country, floods and hurricanes and all types of other natural disasters that they deal with, that this would definitely be applicable towards as well. You've shared already several unfortunate stories about things that happened to people in the face of an emergency when something didn't work. Are there any other real life examples or stories that come to mind for you where emergency response systems have failed or possibly succeeded, if there are any, in protecting people with disabilities? And are there any additional lessons you want to bring out that can be learned from those situations?
Yeah, I live in California and Los Angeles where we have our specific types of emergencies. But of course, if you live in parts of the middle of the United States, you're going to face tornadoes. And with a tornado, you're going to have to go usually into some sort of basement or safe room. And for somebody with a physical disability, that's very hard. But for a person with autism, they may not have a physical disability, but they maybe have behavioral challenges that make it very hard for them in an urgent situation to get into a safe space. And that's where practice comes in. We also hear of this, by the way, with hurricanes, with evacuation for hurricanes and evacuation for floods. You always hear the story of that kid that couldn't get on the bus or from the school or couldn't get into the evacuation zone. And I always immediately say, I bet that kid had autism. And it often comes out that's the case. And the key thing is that those institutions like schools, because it's not like an earthquake can't happen or a fire can't happen when a kid is in school. Of course, just so teachers need to get trained on how to evacuate. We unfortunately in the United States have other kinds of emergencies like gun violence. And when you hear of gun violence in a school and you hear of this child getting hurt, you always know that this was a special education classroom because you hear about what was happening with the children. And so those kids also need to be highly protected and to practice what it means to go into safe spaces or to get under your desk or to understand that the door gets locked and to stay quiet. These are very difficult things and challenges for children with autism, but it can be done. We all know as parents of children with autism that every skill our child gained was because of practice. My son was very late in his toilet training, but it just was lots and lots of practice. It is exactly the same in emergency preparedness. It is just let's figure out what our emergency goals are in practice. I would also say that for people around the world who are listening, there may not be community resources in certain countries that are really going to understand what autism looks like and what autism means. Here in the United States, we have a huge amount of armed police officers that don't exist necessarily in other countries where police don't carry guns. And we've seen emergency situations where police officers take out their guns and they shoot people with autism because they're not abiding by the directions that have been given them. Sit down, stop walking towards me. These are situations that I don't believe we're going to be able to train our way out of with police officers. So I want to shift to a story that's a little bit different than the emergencies that are natural disasters that we've been talking about, and shift to man-made disasters, human-made disasters. And there was a story in Southern California a couple of years ago of a young boy who was about 15 named Ryan Gaynor, who had a lot of behavioral challenges. He was always having aggressive outbursts, and the police had been called multiple times to their house when the family felt they didn't have any other options. And they called the San Bernardino Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, to come because their son had been very aggressive, or perhaps it was the sister who called. And when the police showed up, Ryan was holding some sort of gardening tool. So he was not holding a gun. He was not even holding a knife. He was holding a gardening tool. And the police said, put down the gardening tool. But as many of us know who have family members with autism, they don't follow directions immediately. And he did not put down the gardening tool, and they shot and killed him. And these are the stories where I think the only answer is to not involve armed police officers in our lives ever. And there are people who believe that we should be training police officers. There are many organizations, autism organizations, autism parents, who are out there training police officers. I was one of those. I was part of the Autism Society of Los Angeles' training of over 5,000 Los Angeles Police Department officers. And I teach at UCLA and did a documentary on this exact thing. And then 2 years after doing the documentary, one of the families that works with Disability Voices United dialed 911 and called a police officer to their home. And when the police arrived, the parents said, he's calm now, you don't need to come in, everything's good. But they insisted on coming in because police are naturally aggressive creatures. They are trained in the police academy to respond aggressively when they feel threatened. And sometimes they respond aggressively even when they're not threatened. And went into the home and wanted to teach Isaias a lesson, even though he was sitting calmly on his living room couch, and went to put his hands in the handcuffs. He struggled, and they just wanted to teach him a lesson, and they shot him through the back. He luckily survived. However, he is now paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life, and he has autism, and he is deaf. And he recently won a record-setting lawsuit against the Sheriff's Department of $25 million. So clearly they did a bad thing. But I believe that you cannot count on police to do anything different. Because they have guns, nothing is ever going to turn out good. So this is the same exact story that I was saying at the beginning of this interview, that we need to be prepared and count on ourselves, that we need to build a circle of support in times of whether there's a fire, whether there's a behavioral crisis, whether there's an earthquake. We can only count on ourselves. And if somebody is in a behavioral crisis, you have a plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D. Who's plan A? Maybe you call a psychiatrist, or maybe you call a behavioral specialist. Plan B is calling the neighbors, having them come over to provide support, or a family member that this individual trusts. So you have various steps you can take that avoid at all costs dialing 911. So that's really the moral here of all of these stories, is that we can only count on ourselves and our circles. We are faced with a situation where we demand that the government do more, but at the same time, we should never expect them to do more. And we should be ready to just be on our own, because we know ourselves or our family members the best. And we want to surround them with the kind of loving support that they're going to need.
All right. So speaking of counting on ourselves, what role do advocacy organizations like DVU play in pushing for policy changes, and how can people with disabilities, neurodivergences, and their families get involved in shaping better emergency preparedness plans and more?
People need to understand that policy matters. And as an organization, Disability Voices United is primarily a policy organization. So we do not take individual clients. We do not advocate for individuals in any kind of setting. We advocate for systemic changes that are going to help people with disabilities as a whole as opposed to one person. So how do we create the systems change that we do at Disability Voices United? We create it by building community. We don't create it like we're the best, we know everything, we're the lawyers and we're the specialists and the PhDs and we're going to go out there. No, that's not the way we think about it. We are first and foremost community organizers. And so we go out there and we train self-advocates, people who are people with disabilities and family members to advocate for systems change. We at DVU, we have an emerging leaders program. We've trained over 500 people throughout the state of California who are self-advocates and family members across all disabilities to understand what systems change means and how to advocate for it. We also have what we call a self-advocate speakers training, where we train people with disabilities to go out and do public presentations to various community groups or our hospitals or schools to say, here's my perspective, and you should be listening to me because I'm an expert. I, as a person with a disability, am an expert. I don't have to have a PhD because I'm an expert because I have the lived experience of it. We then take that sort of community that we've created of leaders who are self-advocates and family members, and we set them out to testify before legislatures, testify before school boards, city councils, county boards of supervisors. And we have them understand we need our government to be accountable for helping us, whether it's in an emergency or a non-emergency. And not everybody understands that policies are what gives us our rights. People, especially younger people who weren't around before the Americans with Disabilities Act, they don't get that things were really different in the before the 1980s. We had no right to sue an employer if they discriminated against us. We had no right to sue a hospital if they discriminated against us. How did the Americans with Disabilities Act get passed? It was because of advocacy of people with disabilities and family members. That is how that got done. In California, we have a really significant amount of civil rights, and it all got done because of our advocacy, not because of people who are paid to be in our system. They are people themselves who are going to benefit from these systems changes. We also know that when we look at government officials, they listen to us way more than they listen to those people paid to work with us. We actually are very grateful to the people who are paid to be in our system. My son has 7 staff members, and I am incredibly grateful to all of them every single day. But they are not us. They are not the same thing as us. And when policymakers are thinking about changing policies, they should absolutely be listening to us before they listen to anyone else. That is why we train people to understand why this matters. I could also say in the United States right now, we are facing some really significant challenges by the new administration. We may be having massive cuts to Medicaid, which funds our healthcare and our community services. And so we are now trying to get people to understand, what does it mean to advocate? What does it mean to tell your elected officials, your members of Congress, why healthcare matters to me and why my services matter to me, because I don't want to live in an institution. So it's really building that knowledge for folks, but also that they understand how to tell their stories in persuasive ways in a very brief amount of time, because most policymakers don't have all the time in the world. And we call it our elevator pitch. You have 1 minute, you're riding an elevator, and how do you tell your story and then ask for support to whatever issue you're talking about.
Okay, so you are in California, so you're focused on California. You train people, you reach out to people. What about people that are elsewhere?
I can tell you that there are groups similar to Disability Voices United all over the country and all over many countries in the world, not every country in the world. I think that the difference between Disability Voices United and many other groups is that we are directed by and for people with disabilities and their close immediate family members. And we are exclusively directed that way. I know of other groups that say, oh, yeah, we're directed too. But then I said, is everybody in your staff a person with a disability or family member? Oh, well, no, it's like just our board. Then that's not the same thing because a staff really runs the day-to-day operations of a nonprofit. So if you're outside of California and you're looking for an organization that's similar to DV, the first question you should be asking is how many people with disabilities are on your board or on your staff? And how many family members are on your board and on your staff? Those are the most important questions to ask. Like, how do you take your positions? And if the positions are driven by people with disabilities themselves, then this is an organization that you want to sign on to and you want to be part of and you maybe want to donate to.
All right, Judy, thank you very much for sharing your time, your story, and your passion with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast. You can find it on Apple iTunes, Amazon Music, Spotify, and other popular platforms. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you would like more information on this topic or anything else we've covered on the Autism Resource Podcast, visit us online at autismresourceproject.org/podcast. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future, contact us through the website or comment on any of our social media channels. And be sure to check out our growing website often, since we are continually adding useful information and resources. I want to thank our listeners for spending part of their day with us. This is the Autism Resource Podcast, and I'm Gilda Evans, reminding you to take care of yourself and that special person in your life.